everyone. Welcome to episode 10. In this episode, we're going to lay off the rock for a minute and go towards the more folksy side. I'll be exploring Submarines by the Lumineers, a quite short and simple song, yet carefully crafted. Sure, the instrumentation may be minimal, the chords may be easy to follow, and the form may be extremely simple. But the Lumineers managed to work their genius nonetheless, so let's dive right in. As I said, the form is incredibly simple. A, B, A, B, A, B, A. Just two alternating parts. The instrumentation primarily features a piano and vocals. There's also a drum part, but it's not as dominating as many drum parts tend to be, and there's a guitar and a string section that provides accents. But when we listen to this, we realize right from the beginning that something strange rhythmically is going on. If you try to count 4 beats per measure, you find that it's very difficult to do. So what exactly is going on here? Let's break this down. Let's listen to the opening part of the piano. So we hear this repeating rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Notice how we had 8 counts in that sequence. If we consider each count to be an eighth note, then we can clearly see, as I've drawn here, that we're in 4/4. So it is a heavily syncopated 4/4. But I don't really feel that it functions that way. We don't really feel this is 4 of anything. Let's see what happens when we superimpose a click on each beat of 4/4 on top of this piano part. All that does for us is confirm our suspicions that there was a lot of syncopation. But it doesn't really give us any idea of how this rhythm is organized. If we go back to what it sounds like in our head, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Maybe we could group them that way, and I've actually drawn that out here. So if we superimpose a click at the beginning of each of these 3 groups of eighth notes, we get this instead. So now we're getting somewhere. We can very clearly see that we feel not 4 of something, but we feel 3 beats in a sense, although not all of them are the same length. And this may seem completely crazy until we recall the concept of a compound meter. For example, we have 6/8, which has 2 beats, each consisting of 3/8 notes, even though it is 6/8. A compound meter will take its basic unit, in this case the eighth note, and it's going to glue those units together into larger groups called beats. Now in 6/8, it's always 3/8 notes to a beat. But who said that this grouping had to be constant? So what we get with submarines is technically 4/4, but functionally something that feels like a 3-beat compound meter. However, the middle beat is shorter than the others. Therefore, we always get this feeling of acceleration in the middle of each measure. Further underscoring this 3-beat paradigm is the idea that the chords switch off between these beats. We get G for the first 2 beats, and we get C or D for the final beat. Section B does something completely different. It employs a different compound meter, 12/8, which has 4 beats, each composed of 3/8 notes. So you can see how that really changes up the flow of things between the 2 parts and establishes some rhythmic contrast from part A. Now that we have a more basic sense of the rhythm, we can talk about that drum part more. It's a pretty simple part, and it uses few drums in the kit, yet it builds throughout the song in a very interesting way. In fact, in the beginning, it doesn't have much of a part at all. It sprinkles the song with a few hits every so often, just to provide accent. It isn't until measure 17, or the second section A, that a consistent part begins to emerge. And this consistent part repeats itself every 2 measures. And so when you listen to this, try to count along with that 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. However, this is still a fairly sparse rhythm, even though it may be consistent. There's very few hits here, and the middle beat doesn't even get its own hit in the drum part. However, by the time we get to bar 21, we've filled in that middle beat with a hit of its own in the drum part. So you can hear now that the rhythm has intensified a bit and is a little bit more frequent in hits. Now, towards the end of the third section A, there's another uptake in intensity. And now the drum part sounds like this. So as you can see, the rhythm becomes much more detailed and frequent in hits. And we're no longer getting just one drum hit per beat. We're taking each beat and breaking it into many smaller pieces. Additionally, a new percussive texture emerges here. Prior to measure 41, we only heard the snare and the kick drum in this part. But now in measure 41, a new drum comes in, the low floor tom. It's creating a slightly different texture in the drums and therefore increasing the complexity and the intensity of this drum part, which has been building since the beginning of the song. Now for measures 49 to 52, we get a completely different texture. And it sounds like this. And this is a very different texture than anything we've ever heard because it's the floor toms by themselves, which have a very different sound quality than the snare and kick drum combo. And if you look at a summary of this drum part, you can see very clearly how it begins almost as a non-existent accent, and it transitions into becoming a full-fledged drum part that has an integral part to play in the song's rhythm. Now let's move on to the piano, the main source of tonal instrumentation. Funny enough, it's actually quite simple when it comes to the tonal aspects. It's in G major, with only diatonic notes and just 4 chords. Let's listen to the beginning of the piano part again to remind ourselves. You might notice that there's no left-hand part here, just the right hand. And the right hand is only playing dyads, so only 2 notes at a time. And most of these dyads are thirds. But the piano is much more than a note player. Remember that there's no drumming in the beginning, so the simple piano part is actually doing the critical work of laying down that distinctive rhythm, that 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Now, finally, in measure 21, the left hand begins to play chords. So you can really hear how this fills out the lower registers. And now moving forward, we're playing with our whole suite of registers available to us. Again, this fits the idea of slowly building the song towards the climax. But as we enter the third section A, for measures 29 to 32, we have a very interesting shift in texture. And to understand the shift in texture, we need to remind ourselves what the texture has been up until this point. So far, we've had the piano, drums, guitar, and strings, the full suite of instrumentation. The piano played without a sustain pedal, and it was playing in a relatively lower register. But when we get to measures 29 to 32 in the magenta, the piano is the only instrument and everything else drops out, and we get a very different sound. We can hear that it feels very different. The sustain pedal is being applied now. It's played in a much higher register, and it's also played more quietly. So overall, the texture feels very light and airy compared to what it's been. But the Lumineers are quick to revert the texture back to what it was. So immediately after that measure 32, the piano is joined once again by the drums and the strings, and we just heard there's no sustain anymore. It's being played in a lower register, an octave down, and it's being played louder once again. So by contrast, now we have a texture that feels much more heavy and much more muddy compared to those 4 bars at the beginning of the third section A. But there's something else interesting about those 4 bars. Those 4 bars are the first place where a piano introduces to us a counter rhythm. And when I say counter rhythm, I'm referring to the fact that there are these places where we get 3/8 notes in the right hand, while there's only 2 dotted eighth notes in the left hand. We get 2 against 3, so these rhythms are not going to line up with each other, and therefore we can say the left hand rhythm is counter to that of the right hand, which is playing that common rhythm that we've heard all throughout all of our A sections so far. Perhaps what's even more remarkable is that once we get into the later part of the third section A, past these 4 bars, this piano part doesn't really change that much. Fundamentally, it is the same. The same notes are being played, albeit an octave lower. The rhythms are not changed at all either. So what's remarkable to me is how, without changing the notes that are being played or the rhythms that are being played, creating this texture change through other means is enough to create quite a bit of movement on its own at this point in the composition. In the final B section, we reach a heightened intensity. Of all the B sections, it has the lowest and loudest piano part and the most complex instrumentation. It also has the most complex and busiest rhythms. Look no further than the piano part here, which is still doing the 2 against 3 counter rhythm in the left and right hands. Now we get one last fun little texture change at the very end here. And to really understand this final texture change, let's listen to an excerpt of this final section B to get a sense of the texture. And let's contrast that with an excerpt from the first 4 measures of the last section A, or the outro, as I like to call it. As you can see, contrary to the final B section, the excerpt of this first 4 bars of the outro has a much more sustained sound, as opposed to a staccato sound. First off, we have just the floor toms here, as I had said previously, no snare and no kick. So this overall is going to have a much more boomy, reverberating sound, and it actually sort of drowns out a lot of the left-hand part of the piano. Taking that together with the droning strings, despite the fact that the piano is playing in a staccato articulation, the overall texture of these 4 bars feels rather sustained. But then we get another shift in texture in the final 4 bars. Let's listen to an excerpt from that. We now notice that we've gone back from the floor tom to the snare and kick combo. There's no more string section, and now that staccato piano playing really shines through and dominates the overall texture of these final 4 bars. I'd like us to notice how the texture at the very end also reverts more back to how it was in the earlier parts of the song. We've got the removal of the counter rhythms in the piano. Now we have a drum part that's much more simple. The drum only hits once per beat. The strings have dropped out by this point, and so all in all, the texture here is quite similar to that of around measure 21 in the second section A. So once again, we're really tying together this composition by bringing us back to the beginning. And speaking of which, we actually come to a very simple end. The very end of this song is just a single hit in G major in the piano and no other instruments, and that ends the song. It may seem like quite an abrupt way to end a song that has been full of interesting points, but I'll let you decide if this makes the song abrupt, if it makes it quirky, or maybe a little bit of both. Now, I don't have much to say about the vocals. It's a catchy diatonic melody without harmonies. There also aren't much changes in vocal texture either. It's just a solid vocal melody. But I do believe that this vocal melody gives us some rhythmic foreshadowing of what to expect later on in the song. Here's the basic unit of the rhythm in the vocal part in section A. And it might seem unremarkable until you realize that this is exactly the same rhythm being played by the piano when it first plays the counter rhythm in measure 29. Furthermore, if we take a look at the drum part first introduced in measure 41, we can see that this too is very close to that vocal rhythm. This counter rhythm emerges long before anything in the drums or the piano is actually present from the beginning of the song in the vocals. Finally, I want to comment on those more peripheral accent instruments. We'll start with the guitar. It only shows up in the second section A and the final 4 bars of the song. And while it may at first seem like the guitar pops up at random points in the song, I argue that this is not the case. When we enter the second section A, we have up until this point had a pretty bare bones composition. And so the guitar adds a necessary layer here, adding some more tonal atmosphere to what has been, again, like I said, pretty barren. But by the time we get to the second section B, the other instruments have wrapped up in complexity enough to where this gap that the guitar fills no longer needs to be filled. And then, of course, when the guitar comes back to us at the end of the song, it once again helps remind us of the earlier parts of the song and loops us back kind of to the beginning. There's also those low register strings, perhaps a double bass or a cello, or maybe a combination of both. And it has 2 roles. Its first role is to play a crescendo in the last measure of section B. Let's take a listen. You can hear how this really adds an accent and emphasis to the end of section B, almost to give it a punctuation mark. But note that this doesn't happen in the first B section, and you're probably sick of me saying this, but all good compositions will layer themselves up and build in intensity gradually. Now, second, as you would imagine from low strings, they fill out the bass registers in the third and fourth A sections. And what's even more interesting about this is that they actually work to recontextualize some of these chords. And to see what I mean, let's remind ourselves of that opening part of the piano and listen for the second strike of G major. In the second strike of G major, these are the precise notes that are being played, and so it makes sense that we would just hear G major. But then in the third and fourth A sections, the strings now play an E underneath the piano playing that G major chord, and we get a different sound. You might have noticed already from the notes that are written here, but we hear E minor now because we have E, G, and B. And so what's really interesting is that even though the piano's tonal content has not changed, by placing a different note underneath, the strings have given new meaning to the same notes being played in the piano. Perhaps this is meant to make the second part of the song feel a little more sad. The lyrics certainly convey increasing frustration that nobody believes the singer's submarine sightings. So Submarines by the Lumineers gives us an elegant simplicity. Sure, it may only have 3 instruments, strictly diatonic melodies and chords, and a 2-section form. But the Lumineers are actually masterfully working with a very unusual rhythmic paradigm, switching between a 4/4 that feels more like an odd 3-beat compound meter and 12/8. The vocals cleverly insert a counter rhythm that's later echoed by the piano and the drums. There weren't a ton of conflicting parts, but there was enough going on to create rhythmic complexity. Changes in instrumentation, articulation of said instruments, volume, and register all work together to create different textures throughout the song. These changes were by no means accidental. Like I've mentioned in other songs, Submarines also builds itself up from a modest start to a more energetic and complex middle and end. And perhaps I'm a bit biased as a piano player, but I really believe the piano part is the non-vocal workhorse of the song. That's partially inevitable due to the minimal instrumentation, but the piano forms the tonal and rhythmic backbone of the song, plays the main and counter rhythms simultaneously, and enacts calculated texture changes by changing its volume, register, articulation, and engagement or disengagement of the pedal at specific times. So a huge shout out to this piano part. At the end of the day, it's the simplicity that allows us to notice all these intricate details. We learn from Submarines to appreciate the beauty in the simple things crafted well. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you soon.